Okay, so let's just talk about some definitions just to kind of hang our hats on things. I'm using the term metaphor to describe everything really today in that field. So when we describe one thing in terms of another, that's metaphor. Okay? And it comes from the Greek word metapherein, which is to transfer over. Yeah? Meta above, for to move forward. Yeah? And they use the kind of Greek pot to describe the fact that, you know, we're moving one thing from one thing to the next. And as we're in Cheshire, simile. When working with people on the autistic spectrum, you will probably get away with similes more than metaphors. For example, my son's, who is on the spectrum, we were walking past a shop in Stockport and it was called Fossil. I said, "Oh, that's me." He said, "You're not a fossil." If you said you were like a fossil, then that would be correct, because you are. Yeah. But we use similes a lot, I think. Metonym. We use a lot of these as well. When we say Downing Street said this morning, we don't actually mean Downing Street talking. Yeah, when we say we're going to use plastic, or we talk about the crown, we use things that stand in for other things. And I think that therapy is a metonymical process too, that the therapist stands in for something else often. We're going to talk more about that later. I think it's a broader term than transference. Yeah, maybe it's not just about them reminding us of their parents or grandparents or us thinking about them as children. It can be other stuff. So we're going to talk about that later. These are the things that I think we're interested in as therapists, therapeutic metaphors or deep metaphors, which are consistent recurring images of a life story that give coherence to and aid in the interpretation of events of that life. And they're used by clients to both circumscribe and frame possible solutions to the problems of their lives. That's the kind of stuff I think we're really interested in. That's a therapeutic metaphor. Yeah. And a word that I didn't know before I started doing my doctorate, cryptophore, which is a metaphor that contains hidden meanings. And again, I think we're probably working a lot with those in therapy. Often represented in dreams. You know, the client will come and talk about dreams. I'm very interested in clients' dreams. I don't know about if you are. And there are often cryptophores in dreams. Or they can just be, in the therapy, a client could introduce a metaphor like the White House that a client introduced to me once, and none of us really knew what it meant. It was always there. I've got a feeling it was the end of his therapy, but we never quite got to it. Yeah? He'd get close to it, and he'd talk about the white picket fence around it, and he'd talk about the windows, and sometimes they were smashed in or whatever. But my intuition was never to really take him there, because he didn't really want to go there. There was some hidden meaning, there was something that wasn't quite defined about this place. Yeah, that was a cryptophore as far as he was concerned. Okay, so let's talk about it in practice. Now, I do a lot of work in schools, working with teachers, head teachers, supervising them, supporting them. And I think that we need to make a big change in the way that we deliver education to children. I think we're teaching them all the wrong things, basically, not things that really help them with life. And I'm delighted to notice that, and I'm a member of this thing, which is the Association of Character Education, coming out of Birmingham University. And some schools are jumping on the back of this now, which is about working with children, teaching about empathy and compassion and the important things in life rather than, you know, the hard stuff. And what they found is that when they work on this, the scores go up anyway. Yeah? Doesn't take a genius to work that one out. Anyway, the reason I mention this is I went to their annual conference. And this man, Sir Anthony Selden, do you know anyone come across him? Famous historian, he's the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham, and he's written extensively on happiness. I think is involved in the action for happiness and lots of other things around happiness. So he's involved in this movement. And what he said was, he introduced a metaphor to start with. He says what we're doing with these children is that we're allowing them to fall down, and 50% of them have got mental health issues, and then we send them for counselling when they've fallen into the pit at the bottom, rather than working with them before they fall down. Yeah? And that would be preferable. Yeah? Now, why do you think that metaphor was so useful?
Well, it's a graphic explanation of what's
Absolutely.
what his feelings are.
Yeah. Yeah. So it goes straight into kind of subconscious processing. Yeah. We start to visualize a waterfall. Yeah. It engages our right brain. Yeah. Our more creative brain. We're not thinking logically. He's not said children need to be looked after earlier. He's created a visual image for us to engage with. And because there were mostly teachers there, he's bypassed their defence mechanism, because what he didn't say is, well, it's all your fault that these kids are falling off the waterfall. You're not doing it right. Yeah, we've gone bypast that, and we've gone into their subconscious, around their defence mechanisms, which would be natural if you'd said something logical to them. Does that make sense? And through the delivery of the metaphor, there's a potential for movement of the metaphor. We start to imagine different things or different possibilities. My mind went to that, yeah, using a dam to stop the children from falling off. And then you start to think about what would that dam represent, what would that dam be like? You know, can I be involved in the construction of that dam? Who needs to be involved in the construction of this dam? Wouldn't it be great if we could have a dam that stops these children falling off the waterfall in that very painful, long fall that clients often have before they feel they need to come and see you, or are sent to see you? And through that movement and the potential for movement, what we have is a potential for hope. Yeah? That we can do something about this. It's a hopeful thing. Yeah? We can put a dam up there, or we can get up there and sort these children out before they fall down. Yeah? So metaphors not only bypass natural defences and offer a chance of development and movement, but through that development and movement, there's a chance that we're going to get a hopeful situation out of this.
And is there something about the co-development process of it as well?
We'll talk more about that later, but yeah. I think the metaphors of therapy are co-constructed. Whether you're thinking, whether it's delivered by you or the client, there's something gone on in that therapeutic alliance that's created that visual image that you've got or that your client's got. Yeah, and the hope is that we can move through this metaphor, that we can develop it ourselves, yeah, and come to some kind of resolution through the metaphor. Yeah, and it's easy to talk about cleaning up rivers than it is to talk about the abuse. It's easy to talk about waterfalls than it is to accuse people of doing the wrong job. Yeah, and I think that's a usefulness in metaphor. Yeah, and hope is a huge part of what we do, I think, isn't it? That we silently retain hope on behalf of our hopeless clients. Yeah. I'd like to think we do anyway. Also, the language of metaphor and the language of therapy is dripping in metaphors. We use metaphors all of the time to describe what we do as therapists. You could call it jargon or psychobabble. All right, I've just discussed why it's useful. It can bypass defences. We've got movement. Metaphors are just pervasive. They're in every part of language that we use. I interviewed a therapist who said, I never use metaphors in my work. You can come and interview me if you like, this is for the doctorate. And at the end of the hour interview, he says, crikey, Jonathan, I didn't realise I use them all the time. And it was a real eye-opener for him. Yeah, that even somebody who was a brief solution-focused CBT-based therapist was using metaphors with his clients all of the time. We talked about illumination, didn't we? And bringing, what was unconscious into the conscious awareness of clients in an appropriately timed manner by illuminating things or moving through houses and doors and things, yeah? And I think that's the usefulness of metaphor, is that it helps us bring unconscious material into conscious awareness. It can help build bridges between cultures if you both get the metaphor, but it can also be a problem if they don't understand the metaphor that you're using. So I think you've got to be mindful of the metaphors, because some of them can be quite local or colloquial. But if a client gets your metaphor, then you've really got something to work with. But it can be problematical if you've got a cultural divide and they don't get the metaphor. When you are with a client using metaphor and you're really showing that you understand where they're coming from, then that really builds the rapport and the empathy with a client. Yeah. And some therapists say that the relationship is more important than the content. And if it helps with the relationship, then that's got to be a good thing, I think. And what happens is that we will bring metaphors from outside of the therapy culture. So you might have been aware of a film or a radio program or something that relates to what your client's talking about in that moment. So you're importing it in, and then you're working with that together, and then your client will take that probably and use it outside of the therapy room to describe things to other people or use it in their own mind. So it comes in from outside the therapy culture, gets developed in the therapeutic world, and then will get exported probably to outside world. Does that make sense? And let's just think of the jargon and metaphors that we use in actual to describe what we do. Inner child. There's no child actually living inside of us, although it feels like it sometimes. But what a great metaphor that is. We go on journeys. We use boundaries. There's no actual fences. Parent, adult, child from a TA point of view. Metaphors. The id, the superego. And I just think about some of the books that are in my bookshelf. Walking the Tiger, The Road Less Travelled, The Chimp Paradox, The Broken Mirror. All metaphors to describe what we do. So they're all over the place. We can't get away from them. So let's think about what the different models of therapy say about the use of metaphor. Any person-centred therapists here? Okay. Yeah. Interestingly, person-centred literature says very little about metaphor. It's just a given. Yeah, it's about your way of relating, being in tune, to show empathy, congruence, etc. So they don't need to mention it because it's part of relating, part of who we are, part of a way of being.
That's interesting because when we were introducing ourselves, I thought metaphor, it just happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not something you think about.
But other models prescribe it more for certain situations. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But person-centred, I was really searching high and low to find some literature about the use of metaphor in person-centred because I was aware that that's what will be used. But actually it's interesting, there was no specific mention of it, or very little. More in the process-oriented, Worsley and those kind of people. Tudor will talk about metaphors. But Rogers, whilst he uses metaphors all the time, and his very famous potato, wanting to get to the light, is a metaphor, isn't it? And the seaweed on the rocks that he talks about. Yeah. So he uses metaphor all the time. And if you look at his video with working with Gloria, again, lots of metaphor about utopia and containers and parts of themselves, and but no specific mention of it. Whereas CBT tends to be more prescriptive. They do say that it's useful to work with clients' metaphors, but if you pick up a book on, like the Oxford book on use of CBT, metaphors in CBT, they will list a whole range of therapists introduce metaphors for specific issues and problems that the client will be bringing. So they're issue-based metaphors rather than person-based metaphors. Yeah, like the black dog, for example, which may be very useful for some clients, yeah, but may not. So yeah, the pressure cooker, anger, yeah. They even talk about if a client's got multiple personality disorder, you should be talking to them about Lord of the Rings and Gollum to normalise their experience. I'm not sure I'd be doing that, but that's what the book suggests. Yeah. So CBT is very much issue-led, presenting issue, and you match that with a metaphor to kind of explain what's going on for the client, and probably as a normalising process more than anything else. Now, in the world of psychodynamic therapy, it's all about metaphor. Yeah, and there's a lot of written stuff around why use metaphor in psychodynamic and psychoanalytic theory. One of the main things is this bypassing of defences. That Freud, I'm going to quote one of his references shortly, but he was very much about that the subconscious is guarded by these soldiers that won't let anything past. It's too dangerous or it's too risky for the client. Yeah? And metaphors are a great way of going round the side of those soldiers and into subconscious material. Yeah. It's easier to talk about the river than it is to talk about something horrible that's happened to you, to start with. Yeah? And interestingly, he talks about, and Cox and Thielgaard talk about rooms, that there's an unconscious and conscious realms, the entrance hall and the drawing room, and metaphors can bypass these censoring defences. Metaphors allow the client safe access to hitherto buried and guarded experiences.
That previous metaphor with the soldiers, you could say that you're outflanking.
Yeah, outflanking. Yeah, good word. Yeah, not being a soldier before, I didn't realise it outflanked. But yeah, that's what happens, isn't it? When you've got those what Napoleon against, yeah, and you go around the side, don't you, to outflank them? Yeah, because you don't want a battle, really. Jungians will work with dreams. A lot of clients' unconscious materials are tied up in dreams, recurring dreams. And I just see dreams as metaphors or cryptophores, that you work with the metaphor of the dream. And the client can bring the dream in and you can start to use it as you would do with a normal metaphor with a client. And develop it. So I think all things like dreams, fantasies, symbols, imagery, visualization. We talked about, the sea, Lee, and the fact that you hadn't quite developed it into a metaphor. That was the beginning of a metaphor, yeah? Or you could describe it as a metaphor in itself, really. Yeah. Are all messages from the unconscious mind. And the client is, at some level, trying to convey these to you unconsciously. And if you don't pick them up in that particular moment, they'll offer you it again later on in a different metaphor. And then again in a different metaphor. And we're missing these opportunities, I think, unless we're tuned in to the client's metaphors, that they're wanting to tell you something unconsciously. Okay, so as I said, it's not all fun and games in the world of metaphor. There are certain things that, pitfalls, to use a metaphor, you can overvalue them. You can use them all of the time. And when I was on placement a decade and a half ago, a client said, if you use one more metaphor, I'm going to leave this room. And she was an English teacher. Yeah, I was getting carried away with them. I think I was just giddy with metaphors. Yeah. So I think they need to be used appropriately. But also we can undervalue them. We can go very literal with our clients. We can ignore the rich, deep metaphors that they're offering us and just go, oh yeah, and that means, and just give them a literal interpretation. Yeah. And I think you've missed an opportunity there if you do that. We can literalise them. And our clients can literalise ours. Remember the autistic conversation. And certain people with certain personality adaptations, etc., may take your metaphors as very literal and very concrete. Yeah. So when you say, I laughed my head off, then you didn't actually, your head didn't come off. And sometimes, we can get carried away with metaphors where you just perhaps need to just say something very simple, like you need to love yourself, or we can go right round the metaphorical garden, but actually there's something just needs to be said. Yeah, and we can use them to go away from kind of other social meanings. They can be used as an excuse to avoid deeper social meanings. Sometimes we can oversimplify things. And sometimes we can use them perhaps to salve our own anxiety. Or let's deliver a metaphor to this person rather than talk about that which needs to be talked about. So a lot of it is about timing, a lot of it is about intuition, a lot of it is about gut feeling, a lot of it is about appropriateness. And sometimes your client unconsciously is screaming, saying, please pick up this metaphor.
There's also something about meaning, isn't there? Because you mentioned about the White House earlier. It's very easy to catch hold of a metaphor and kind of run with your own kind of meaning that you connect to. But it's really important when you're working with metaphor to check out what the meaning is, because very often it's very, very different to yours. Absolutely,
yeah, absolutely. What did you get from that? Is often the question I might ask. Yeah. But I think when you're in it and you're developing it with your client, then there becomes a kind of mutual understanding of what is going on. But if it's mostly coming from you, and that reminds me of X, and let me tell you about that metaphor, and blah, 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 the client might be somewhere else completely. So you're right, it's about checking in. Yeah. And I think it's preferable if the client helps you build that metaphor. Yeah, so you build this thing together. Yeah.
Well, like just for example, the use of the river. One person's use of a river can have a completely different meaning from somebody else's use of the river or the sea or anything. There are different kind of aspects to it that people kind of connect to. So
absolutely.
It's about it's about kind of checking in. So what does the river mean to you? What is it about the river that feels kind of important to you, as opposed to kind of going with your own river.
Yeah. So for example, a client was working on a river in a metaphor with me recently, and he was going really fast on this river, and I was thinking, oh, this is going too fast, there's a lot of anxiety and etc. involved in this. But he enjoying it. He was enjoying the thrill of it. He liked going fast at that particular time. Yeah, but you can tell by his face and his smile on his face, and that in that moment he was actually enjoying that race, sibling race with his brother on jet skis down the river.
The seven bore.
The seven bore, yeah. So we can make assumptions that aren't quite in tune with our client, is the point. But there again, you've got to bear in mind the whole context of the therapeutic relationship and what's going on in that moment and their body language and everything else that will be feeding you information about the client's perception. Because again, you might think that they're on top of this beautiful hill and everything is wonderful, but they're crying and getting really upset. Yeah, and what's that about? Yeah, some clients, if you're introducing metaphors and they just don't get it, or they are not visual particularly. Now some clients are very visual, most clients are quite visual, but some, and that includes myself, are more kinesthetically wired up. So we don't visualise very much, we just get senses that we're near rivers. Now it's not about them doing it wrong, it's just about their predominant way of being with the world. So, you need to recognise that. And sometimes I might ask them a question just to work that one out. And a good question to find out now is if you can remember something that happened to you quite big in your life, how do you recall it? And I'll give an example of I jumped out of a plane at 15,000 feet. Okay? And my predominant memory of that is the wind rushing against my face. Like when you're a kid and you stick your head out of your dad's car and you're going 70 miles an hour. Whoosh, that's my predominant memory of that. I don't think necessarily about the fact that I could see the Isle of Man and Blackpool Tower because it was Grange-over-Sands that we jumped from. So if I was working with someone like that, I would be mindful that I'm not going to be visualising that much. And it might be more about senses, or it might be more about embodied metaphors that we're going to talk about more later, about butterflies in stomach or sensations that turn into metaphors in the body. And we can mature those rather than the visual. That makes sense? But if you were to ignore that and carry on regardless, the client might think they're doing it wrong. And they're already low self-esteem will get another bashing. And we don't really want to do that as therapists, do we? Try to avoid that where we can. And metaphors can be used by the client as a way of avoiding conflict, challenge, can be a bit of a power struggle. Now, if a client knows that I'm really into metaphor, and they've seen some writings, they've seen that painting up on my wall, and it could be a great avoidance to introduce a metaphor when we get towards a challenging situation. And that might be great for them, might be very appropriate, might be just the space that they need. But it will be an avoidance. And that's okay, because they don't want to go there right now. So you hang out around. But perhaps you just need to note in the back of your mind that why they're introducing this to you right now. Is it of therapeutic use? Or is it just a version of them looking at the pigeons landing on the on the windowsill, which often they do, to avoid what's happening. Yeah, so as I said before, people with certain kind of clinical issues or borderline clients, I'm not into kind of labelling people, but when you've got people that with certain kind of psychoses, or they may well take them too literally for them to be of use for you to work with. But we're only talking about a very small percentage of the client population. Depends on where you work, of course. Yeah, but the vast majority of clients that come in to see you will be up for talking metaphorically. There's another metaphor. It can be used as a silencing device. Yeah, we can crush it. I think we've got to be very gentle with clients' metaphors and just bring them out gently, almost like holding a hummingbird. don't take hold of it yourself. Oh yes, let me tell you about my version of that metaphor. It's about very gently coaxing the client's metaphor out and allowing it to just sit there and be looked at and be dealt with and held gently, rather than you grabbing it, lassoing it.
Sorry to interrupt.
Pardon?
I have to discipline myself not to say, oh, you mean it's a bit like, or
Yeah.
I have a bit to say, okay. Tell me a bit more about that. No. Go on. Just wait and wait.
Yeah, and that's where clean language can be very useful, because, you know, what's that like, or what you're experiencing now, can be very useful, clean questions that help the client stay in the metaphor and keeps the hummingbird going, basically, which might turn into a dragon. But if we go like that, it's gone. Okay, let's just move on to some findings, because we've got a bit more time. So we can do more experiential stuff afterwards, yeah? We'll get the boring bit done first. What I found was that there was recurring themes in my doctoral research around the use of metaphor. If you can't read those, it relates to the environment that you're working in, the mutuality of the metaphor with your client, the depth of the metaphor, the fact that useful therapeutic metaphors often contain an element of hope, movement and hope, that they're everywhere and you can't avoid them, and this thing about standing in for metonymically, which is a broader concept than transference on its own. So, let's just think about this. Hope. One of my participants said that she would not use a metaphor herself unless it contains some element of hope. Which is interesting. Now, other people may argue against that, you know, false hope is an awful thing to offer a client. And interestingly, the use of metaphors in bereavement work was often quoted. And that offers an element of hope that doesn't have to be specifically spoken about. We don't have to say, I'm being hopeful. Yeah, we can just hang around with metaphors which may contain an element of hope for the client. And that might be spiritual hope, that might be lights at the end of the tunnel, or chance of seeing things differently. But hope seemed to be a really important. I think it's the aspect of potential movement with metaphors and development of metaphors which offers a change, which is what clients often want, is a change of what's happening in their lives, or the change of the way that they see what's happening in their lives. And that's the hope bit.
So you're saying it needs to have an element?
No, I'm not saying that at all, but this is what one participant said, that she thought it was all about hope.
I'm just thinking about using metaphor in regard to bereavement. I think that you would have to be tread a fine line that it didn't become a platitude.
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah.
That it was condescending in some way.
Absolutely.
Or accepted in a, you don't really care what I'm feeling, you just say the words.
And I think it'd probably be useful to follow the client's metaphors.
Yes.
Which I think it's always useful to follow the client's metaphors, but particularly in
that
that.
is an area where there's a huge collection of off-the-shelf metaphors in bereavement. You know,
Yeah.
so the waterfall, the turbulence, and all that.
Yeah, and we're going to talk more about the appropriateness of introducing your own metaphors later, because some therapists have like a shelf of metaphors, and they'll go, all right, okay, that one is appropriate for you right now. I'm going to drag that one out, and I'm going to deliver that to you.
Would you like to come up and see my metaphors?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and interestingly, it was the more psychodynamic psychotherapists that tended to do that, rather than the person-centred counsellors, in my experience of working with the research participants. But just thinking about the element of hope, and Hope is a good book by Dennis O'Hara on hope in therapy. He talks about hope as a verb and hope as a noun. Yeah. that clients often come in expecting some kind of hope to being delivered to them at some unconscious level. Yeah. So, you know, they want it from you. And talking about going into hospitals, you know, we want to be delivered some hope from the doctors. I don't think they're particularly good at it. But, you know, that's hope as a noun. Let me give you some hope. Hope as a verb is an actual, you know, a being hopeful. So I think what happens is that your hope as a verb, as a client, as a counsellor, will transfer to the client, hopefully. So they become hopeful as a verb, rather than expecting it to be delved out to them. Does that make sense? It's quite an interesting way of seeing hope. Time for some poetry. This is a poem I did that kind of captured the experience I had in researching metaphors in therapy. Would you like me to read it out to you? It's quite small writing. I am like the wind, I am the train on the tracks that runs and runs and runs. I am from you, me, us, them. I am like the glue that binds, the magnet that repels, the missing in the fog. I am like my child. I can play, I can smile, can cry. I can find strength from here. I am like a bird. I can fly, I can drift as high as the cloud. I can burrow deep into the cloud. I'm always there, ready, on the shelf, in the dream, in this moment. I'm like the creator. I can change, colour, shape, your world and mine. I am like the gift, the chameleon pathway to your mind. I'm like the knot in your gut. I rest in your heart. I rest in your neck. Like the blade in your side, I hold the dreams that you cannot tell. I am like what you are like. Change me, you, our hills, caves and dance floors. I'm like the monster sleeping in the dark that leads to doors, doors hiding smiles behind. I'm like the crack in the cult, the safe dungeon, the shiny hub, the frozen rose. I am like the tissues in the box. I am hope. I am like. So that was kind of me trying to encapsulate everything about the use of metaphor in therapy. Anything come out of that poem for you? Okay. I was really lucky that I got to do a heuristic study which allowed me to do paintings and poetry, which really are appropriate for metaphor usage. Let's talk about metonym for a little while. One of my wonderful participants said the following: the therapist is a metaphor for a lover, a caregiver, a teacher, a maiden, a shaman. You are the shapeshifter, a chameleon, whoever your client needs you to be while still being yourself. Yeah, I wonder what clients actually think. You know, are you the wizard? Are you the guru? Are you the dinosaur? When they come to see you. Yeah, and what are they to you? You know, are they a core assessment form? Are they 70 quid? Are they whatever? What do they remind you of? It might not just be a transferential aspect. So have you got any questions so far on what we've been talking about? I know it's a bit heavy and a bit technical to start with, but I promise you it will get lighter and more after coffee. So maybe you could start thinking about some clients in slightly different ways than just transferential ways, and sometimes it can be useful for the client at the appropriate time to have that fed back to them. Yeah, and often the client will be bringing stuff in about you that you won't talk about. You know, do they hope that you're some kind of wisdom? Yeah. The whale in the desert guy. And we're going to do one of these exercises after break. But his problem, his issue, was like a whale in the desert. Horrible thing to go through, isn't it? Yeah. And I asked the brave question: well, if you're the whale in the desert, what am I in this desert landscape? Yeah? And I was the signpost, helping him go past the whale. So that was very illuminating. Yeah? I realised that perhaps the last few months I was just helping him avoid. But maybe that was okay. Yeah? It's a close call, isn't it, between whether you push a client or not. But to know that I was a signpost was very useful for me. To know that I was enabling him to avoid going through the whale. And he's now pretty much through the whale. And beyond the whale was a beautiful, interesting town that he could go and engage with. And it's a social anxiety client, so he could go and be with people once he'd been through the whale. And the whale is a constant metaphor that we can use as some kind of gauge going forward. How far are you through the whale at the moment? Or nearly there. Or I'm halfway through. It's horrible. That makes sense. And I will often use blank landscapes to allow my client to fill in the rest. So deserts are quite useful. Rivers are useful. Yeah. You know, if you were a river right now, what would that be like? Oh, it's going really fast, or it's sluggish, or is it water that you could drink? Oh, no. Yeah, so you're getting lots of clues, aren't you, about what's happening to the client, using a kind of blank screen. Yeah, and nature's usually a good blank screen. Yeah, we don't take people to the A6, generally. Any more questions, or comments, or notes before we kind of start to wind this up?
I think the one that's staying with me is something that actually happened yesterday, and I guess that's why it's still in my mind. That it's okay to offer a metaphor, provided you can offer it in a way that they can take it or leave it.
Absolutely.
And yesterday I saw a woman, she said, I went to the doctor and I got a prescription for some kind of medication, and I put it in my purse, and I didn't ever go and get the drugs. And it was like and she kind of stopped, and so I sort of waited, and she couldn't kind of get it, she couldn't find something. So I said, so it's like, what, an insurance policy? And she said, no. And I thought, okay. And then but then that kind of moved on. She said, it's like a talisman. She said, and I just kept it in my purse. And I didn't ever go get the medication. And so if you,
Absolutely.
you can kind of offer something in the right way, and they feel confident to throw it back at you and say no.
And that was about the rapport with you had with that client, possibly. She was able to say no. But it's also a good way of being tentative. It's a good way of offering things to clients that isn't a direct, again, it's bypassing the defence mechanisms. And often they can just disregard it or change it. But it's easier to do that, or more ethical or more appropriate to do that, than be more direct about it. Yeah, and the wonderful thing about metaphors is that they can take them or leave them. Yeah, and they can drift in and drift out, and they're not a direct, threat to their core or their ego. So yeah, and I think it's important to be tentative with clients, isn't it? Rather than saying, "No, I think it's this." That's what you've got. Rather than like an insurance policy. No, not quite, but then you started something, didn't you? You were developing the metaphor with her then. So it started to become a kind of therapeutic aspect of the work. Yeah. Great, that's what we're talking about. Yeah.
In Stockport therapy, I remember long ago, doing an exercise where I asked the client to pick something in the room. So they picked like a clock, and then they became the clock. Is that...
Yeah, that's exactly, yeah. I would use that in supervision as well. Yeah, so when a client comes into your room, first of all, and you can ask them what in the room is appealing to them, and they become that thing. Also, it can be useful in supervision. I used that recently. I have a string of elephants in my room, little elephants from a client who came back from India. And I was talking to the supervisee and I said, thinking about this client, what comes up for you in this room right now? And it was a little blue elephant, squeaky blue elephant. The client had no voice. Yeah. And it was useful for him to hold this squeaky little blue elephant in his mind while he was working with this client, this voiceless elephant that actually could be bigger and stronger if you think about it, couldn't they? Yeah. And no one's mentioned mine yet, have they?
In the room.
Which is actually in my office, in the corner, just sat there, all of the time. Well, kind of, but it's very useful because sometimes the client may say, oh, I'm avoiding something just like that, or I might say, is it one of those? And point gently at the elephant. So,
I'm so drawn to it, I can't stop looking at it.
and he's lost his tusk in transit. Bringing him here from Bramhall, he lost his tusk. He only had one tusk. But again, that might be, and I can use him as a, he's not perfect. With clients that have a perfection drive. Look at that elephant. It's got no tusks. Still beautiful, though, isn't it? He didn't notice. Yeah.
Maybe I'm not very observant, but I was more interested in the texture of it.
Yeah. Very heavy, actually. It's solid wood. But yeah, interesting thing. So I deliberately put things around my room to potentially engage clients with metaphorically. And that's a good way of doing it with new clients.
It's really powerful on it, isn't it?
Very powerful.
The response they get to it.
Yeah.
Jonathan, I once used metaphor inappropriately, and yet it worked.
That's okay then.
Yeah, well, I had a client who was a musician, and she'd been referred to me, and for the first 2 sessions she said nothing. So I went to supervision and he said, use the language of music, talk to her about, is she feeling major or minor?
Right, okay, yeah.
So I looked all of this up, didn't know what I was talking about myself, but I went in and she burst out laughing and she said, I don't know what you're talking about, I'm self-taught. So
But that opened up
the
something.
ice.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, it's interesting actually. I tend not to do it, when electricians who come in and talk about circuits
Yeah, it
and
didn't
things
feel
like that.
right.
It doesn't feel right. But interesting, they can come out in their metaphors. So I do this session called the control room sometimes, where they go into the control room of the mind, and they'll change things, increase confidence or whatever. And often, if they're like electricians, it will be they'll have sliders and all kinds of things. So they sometimes bring that in, or the musician might have things more like chords and things like that. So it does come in, but forcing it can be a bit.
Yes.
But it worked. But again, that's the thing about rather than it was a gentle offering, wasn't it? And she didn't have to take it, and it lightened. There's an energy about metaphors that's similar to humour.
Yes.
Yeah, that has a lighter energy to it. It's not as serious, and I think that can be useful in therapeutic work. Yeah. And I was with my supervisor yesterday. He mentioned 2 metaphors. I've been working with a lot of clients with child protection issues recently, and he was talking about, do you have a wall that protects you from that? And also, 2 clients, I don't know if it happens to you, but 2 clients that look very similar, had the same uniform on, came in one after each other, looked the same, and had similar presenting issues. So I'm thinking, crikey, I'm worried about, these guys are going to kind of merge in my mind. How am I going to sort this out? So he asked me to convert them into animals. It's just to define them, really. So one became a white horse, and the other one was a tortoise. So now I know that there's the white horse and there's the tortoise, and that's going to help me differentiate between those 2 clients, which is quite useful, I think. Any more questions before we go for a coffee? We're going to do something experiential when we come back. It's going to be fun and dancing and singing.
I just want to say I have a question. It's just popped into my mind, so it's not fully formed. But I was just thinking, what is the difference between metaphor and euphemism? Is there one? Because like euphemism is something, especially in British culture, we have quite a lot of them, don't we? And I suppose in my mind that's kind of more of a negative thing, something that's not being said, but it's another way of describing something. Are they the same thing?
What, can you give me an example of what we were thinking?
So just thinking of a funny story my friend told me about her granny saying, I'm going to go and spend a penny, and she said, I'll come with you, 'cause she thought she was going shopping. I think
Right.
she was going to the loo.
Right.
So that would be a euphemism.
Right, yeah, so it's kind of colloquial language to
Yeah.
describe what's going on.
Yeah, and I think they are the same,
Right.
but the other bit that you've got in euphemism is that it's a kind of polite or understated way with
Yeah,
which
talking around.
Describing
something.
the indescribable.
Yeah, yeah, so kind of the same then.
it's very British.
Yeah.
I know, I say I regard it as being less than that English. Very English thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, you're probably
Yeah.
right there.
yeah, and we may use it, we may not. And I would say that would be more conversational metaphor rather than therapeutic metaphor, which helps build rapport.
Yeah.
But there can be a culture clash, like you just found out. He's not going to spend a penny.
Yeah.
Or again, autistic clients might wonder
Yeah.
why you're going to spend a penny.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Or an African client might wonder what a penny is.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to wind this part of the session up now. We can all relax.